Ladies and gentlemen, I have the honor today of sitting here and talking with Dr. Benjamin Bikman, the research scientist who has written the book we are going to be discussing today that has made such a huge difference in my life and my wife's life. And to give you an idea of how huge a difference it is, I'm sharing with you the picture of myself and my wife just 18 months ago when we started our ketogenic journey. This is what we looked like at the start. This is what we look like today. And
That's
along with
something
the
else.
and along with the changes in our health, I mean, losing the weight, the changes in our health were so much more dramatic than the actual weight loss that we shared right here. And
Well, I can't help but notice the cane in one picture, Ken, and then the cane being absent in the subsequent photo. That's wonderful.
Well, you have to understand my wife's situation. She has Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is a degenerative disease that affects the connective tissues. And we were actually looking forward to she was looking forward to the day we could get hip replacement surgery. Now she's walking 1.5 to 3 miles a day when we walk our dogs as a result of changing our diet. Now, in my wildest dreams, I never would have dreamed that changing the diet would have that much effect. But I showed you my pathology when I sent that slide of my case: sleep apnea, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, diverticulitis. And it goes back to your book. But here's what I compare your book to. This is a little meme. Give everybody a chance. Well, this is the owner's manual for the human body. Because as we age and as we suffer the effects of the diets we've chosen, we don't get much help from doctors. And I'm not holding doctors at fault. It's just the way modern medicine has evolved. You know, they have to hit so many people in so many minutes. You go see a doctor, you get 10 minutes. And by the time he's looked at your labs and everything and turns around, half that time is gone. And we as patients don't know the kinds of questions we need to be asking our doctor. And that's where this book comes in. Why we get sick. It's like the human body owner's manual. And
that's a great description, Ken.
Well, literally, the way this book was written is you go through and you break down all the human body systems in priority and how they relate with each other, but you do so in such a way that makes it easy to understand. This is the most unscientifically written book I've ever read on the human body, because it's written so easy to understand. It's written in language that I, as a non-scientific, non-medical person, can easily grasp. And that's why this book is so important, because this is Guam. This conference took place in the Rotary Club in 2019, before COVID hit. And I highlight your comment here. As a reminder, note that insulin resistance per se won't kill you. It's just a reliable vehicle that can rapidly get you there by causing other life-threatening conditions. I mean, that is the key here, because I had, like I said, type 2 diabetes, arthritis, diverticulitis, irritable bowel syndrome, a host, such a long list. And as I read this book, your book hit every single one of those comorbidities and how it related to diet. So as I was changing my diet, everything from tinnitus to my vision, to my ability to walk without braces got better. And so for the sake of the people who are watching this for the first time and haven't heard of you before, could you tell us how you came into this field.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Ken. Thanks for reaching out. Happy to share some of my insight with you and your audience, and really admire what you and Kim are doing there in Guam. My journey has been unexpected, frankly. I never imagined 15 years ago or so, when I began, when I officially declared my interest in pursuing science as a career, and that is to pursue academia and become a professor and a scientist. I never imagined I'd be studying something called insulin resistance, because I didn't know what it was. But I knew I was interested in the body, which was the beginning of my graduate studies. And I knew I was increasingly interested in obesity and diabetes. And then there was a series of papers published in the late 90s. I found them a couple years later. This was early 2000s for me. And they detailed how the fat cells become insulin resistant and pro-inflammatory. And that was thought to be the connection between rising fat or obesity and rising insulin resistance, which ultimately led to type 2 diabetes. But insulin resistance was the great mediator that was connecting these twin epidemics, obesity and type 2 diabetes. Again, insulin resistance was the thread pulling them together. And that discovery of mine, discovering the discoveries of other scientists at the time as a young graduate student, that's what put me on the path that I'm still on. I'm delighted that through a series of what has always seemed like to me to just be me kind of making the best decision at the time of what I wanted to study next during my PhD, and then during my postdoctoral fellowship, and then even now being an independent scientist these past 11 years. It's insulin resistance has continued to be an area of interest. And it just happens to be that this is also the most common disorder in the world. And then it was, once I began teaching as a professor, so not just being a scientist, but once I began teaching, I was wondering what I might be able to teach this next little generation of future nurses and doctors, which are the majority of the students that I teach at my university. And I thought, well, I should emphasize something that I'm an expert in, which is insulin resistance. And that is when I began to really, truly realize the scope of insulin resistance, not just how common it was, but how relevant it is to so many diseases. I once had thought it was only relevant in the context of, say, type 2 diabetes. And then the reality, as my eyes were opened, and as the book outlines, insulin resistance is relevant to almost every chronic disease. And you've mentioned a handful of the most relevant ones already.
Yeah, that was right here in the book. There's I'm still getting the hang of this. Okay, there, hit the share button. That's not what I wanted to share. All right, let's see, where's this? Okay, now this is what I wanted to share. This is in the book. Ah, there we go. Now let's see, this is a screen. It was a screen. Oh, there it is. This is the one of the first charts in the book where it looks at the correlation between insulin resistance and type 2 diabetes. And this is where it really started driving things home for me, because as you have talked about in your talks, insulin resistance shows up so much earlier than type 2 diabetes. And if we had diagnosed insulin resistance and changed our lifestyles accordingly, we might have been able to avoid type 2 diabetes. Because my wife was diagnosed at 42. She's 65 now. I was diagnosed at 63. And so by the time I was diagnosed, I was already 338 pounds.
Yeah, yeah.
And so that's why I'm thinking that the point you make, and this is something that everybody that we've been talking with in our local meetings and in recommending the book, is start, A1C is nice, but make sure you start getting tests for insulin resistance. Yes.
So that is to briefly explain the thought process behind that graph that you just mentioned that I put together for the book, we look at these two variables, namely insulin and glucose. First of all, it's important to note that they're not the same thing. Even well-educated individuals in the biomedical fields conflate the two of them. They confuse and mix the two. Glucose is the energy in the blood, blood sugar. It's one of many energies. And then insulin is a hormone that does many, many things throughout the body. It literally will affect every single cell in the body. At some of the body's cells, like muscle cells or fat cells, it will stimulate those cells to pull in glucose. And that's the main mechanism whereby insulin, when glucose is going up, will help lower the glucose. Glucose climbs in the wake of a starchy or sugary meal. Insulin will be released. And its most famous, not even its main, but its most famous purpose is to then push that glucose back down in the blood by pushing the glucose into the muscle and the fat cells in particular. And then having done its job, insulin also comes back down to normal levels. Well, as someone's progressing, as a healthy individual is progressing towards type 2 diabetes, like you and Kim were, over the years, conventional medicine would have only ever been looking at the glucose with no regard to the insulin. We look at type 2 diabetes as wholly a disorder of glucose. And I say we've gotten it totally wrong. Type 2 diabetes is a disease of insulin. It's a disease of too much, and the insulin isn't working well anymore, namely insulin resistance. But if we look at the average individual who's progressing towards type 2 diabetes, and the fact is most of us are on that spectrum or on that path, and you can see that just by the growing number of people with type 2 diabetes, higher every year, we're only ever looking at the glucose, and we're waiting for the glucose to change. We may be diagnosing the person with hypertension or infertility or osteoarthritis, and we don't think any of those have anything to do with the glucose because they are getting these diseases and the glucose is staying normal. But if we could shift our paradigm away from the glucose and look at the insulin, we would have detected that while a person would be coming in for 10 or 20 years and their glucose is always hovering around normal, their insulin would have been climbing and climbing and climbing. And indeed, you can detect this state of normal glucose levels in the blood, but significantly elevated insulin levels decades, 10 or 20 years before the glucose ever changes. And it's only when the body has become so resistant to the insulin that even though it's swimming in a sea of insulin, it just isn't working well anymore. Now the glucose levels start to climb. But that's the problem. If we could shift the paradigm away from the glucose and focus more deliberately on the insulin, then we could detect the problem much, much sooner. And by acknowledging that type 2 diabetes is actually a disease of too much insulin, then we treat it much better as well.
Yeah, because I think, there's a stereotype that body size, body weight is an indicator. But I have a friend he was 130 when he graduated from high school. He's 135, and he was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes a couple of years ago. So, it goes back to the fact that the rising insulin doesn't necessarily generate obesity in everybody.
That's right. No. In fact, that's right. Yeah. And I haven't even, I didn't even attempt to put obesity on this kind of series of events or the sequence of events because it gets a little muddy. The fact is, it's not how much fat we're storing that becomes relevant. It's how we are storing our fat. As you know, because I explain this in the book, you could have individuals who are gaining fat over the years, or not appearing to gain fat, like your friend. It's not how much fat we're gaining; it's where. It's where and how we're gaining it. Where you could have individuals who are getting fat because their fat cells are reaching a maximum size, and it's when that's a process called hypertrophy. And these are fat cells that become pro-inflammatory and insulin resistant. And that is what I believe typically will push the insulin resistance along. So insulin resistance can indeed start at the fat cells. But in the case of your friend, say, who hasn't appeared to gain any fat, hasn't appeared to. The reality could be that over the years, he has in fact lost a little muscle and has in fact gained a little fat, even though his weight hasn't changed. What he's made of might have changed. But even still, It would be maybe where we're storing fat or other signals coming in. And we know that while elevated insulin can promote insulin resistance, so too can stress and inflammation. People with autoimmune diseases who may be perfectly lean and otherwise healthy, when their autoimmune disease is very active or aggressive, the body is more insulin resistant. And as the autoimmunity is experiencing a bit of a down phase and they're feeling better, the insulin resistance goes away and the body becomes more insulin sensitive. And then, as I mentioned with stress, even like people who have chronically bad sleep have elevations in stress hormones, namely cortisol and epinephrine. And those are hormones that will fight against insulin. So it's not always as clear cut as we think. And that while there is certainly a strong reason to suspect insulin resistance in someone who's obviously overweight or who obviously has more fat than would be healthy, it's not always the cause.
Well, that's an important distinction to make, because we always see these people who've been healthy but heavy and have no signs of diabetes. Now, it could be one of two things. It could be that the A1C hasn't caught up with them yet.
Mm-hmm.
And it could be that they're like you said, where they're storing their fat.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
I stored my fat pretty much inside, because when I started going on a ketogenic, I'm one of those ones that gets keto breath.
Mm-hmm.
And I can tell when I'm burning body fat because I get the keto breath. And when I eat, it minimizes. And
Mm-hmm.
then, a few hours or 4 or 5 hours later, it starts to increase.
Yeah.
And, I've gone down from, 43 down to 28 on a body mass indicator.
Yeah, that's amazing. Yeah, so Ken, to your point that you mentioned a moment ago, I may as well finish the thought I had, which is that some people have the genetic ability to make new fat cells. So rather than having fat cells really get big, the person will have fat cells that actually stay pretty small. They just keep making new fat cells. And these are people who paradoxically have an almost limitless potential for fat gain. These are the people who can become 500 or 600 pounds, and most people cannot get that big under any circumstances. And they stay insulin sensitive. Metabolically speaking, they're still reasonably healthy. And the paradox is simply in that if you can continue to store fat in fat cells and the fat cells are healthy, like you have with what's called hyperplasia or hyperplastic fat cells, then that's what you have happening. With hyperplasia, the fat cells just keep multiplying and they always stay healthy. You just have a lot more of them. And so then again, paradoxically, these are the people who can gain an incredible amount of fat and stay healthy.
Well,
reasonably healthy.
What I wanted to go back to is because here we're having a obesity crisis on our island, as in many other places, and that obesity is helping drive the diabetes rate. We're probably over 30% diagnosed diabetes cases.
Yeah, and insulin resistance, which is undiagnosed, would probably be well over half.
Yeah. So how does lifestyle changes affect insulin? What changes can people do?
Yeah, so that's the good news of it all, Ken. And I like to joke that my book, the first part of the book, the majority of the book kind of reads like a horror story. We're talking about this villain and it's just coming in and killing the body. But it is a horror story with a happy ending, which is that you can stop this almost immediately. So I think maybe it's helpful to describe the causes. I've already mentioned them, and I'll just outline them again more succinctly. I believe there are three primary causes of insulin resistance. One, chronically elevated insulin, which is affecting fat cells, but too much insulin causes insulin resistance. Stress and inflammation. Well, stress and inflammation are very hard to control. Those are, if you tell someone lower your stress, they say, thanks. Now I'm going to be even more stressed because I don't know how to do that. If you tell someone to lower their inflammation, assuming those two are even relevant in that person, and they aren't in everybody, they may say, well, how do I lower my inflammation? Those are vague things. These are, if there are three levers that we can grab to control insulin resistance, the stress and inflammation levers are very slippery. It's hard to get a good firm grasp on them. The insulin lever is very easily manipulated. It's very easy to control. Well, it's simple to control, but that doesn't make it easy. And I'll clarify that in a moment. But if you can get someone to change their lifestyle habits, which is why it's not easy because it's difficult to change habits, then you can immediately start to lower that insulin. And then the body begins to become immediately more insulin sensitive. I mean, Ken, the results are so dramatic that you can take people that when you start to change their diet to lower their insulin, they can get off all of their diabetes medications in just weeks, even medications and months, medications they've been on for years. They have to start immediately changing the dose. And so that's why it's important for people to, of course, work with their medical providers to make sure they're doing it well if they're on medications. But the short and skinny of it is the simplest way to lower insulin, I believe, is a four-pronged attack. And it's simple, but that doesn't mean it's easy. I keep emphasizing that because when we start talking about changing the diet, we're talking about addictions and deep-seated habits. The first is to control carbohydrates. If someone can start to basically don't eat your carbohydrates from bags or boxes with barcodes. If you can focus your carbohydrates on unprocessed, meaning not juiced or smoothied or anything, fruits and vegetables, that's the way to go. And then the more starchy the grains, or the more processed it, then those are you want to avoid. So control carbohydrates. I'm not saying don't eat any, just be smart about them. And then the other two kind of go together, which is prioritize protein and don't fear fat. I put them together because in nature, the best proteins come with fat. Always, 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 no exceptions. The best proteins are animal sourced proteins. That's going to be meat, dairy, or eggs. And they always come with fat. And that's how we should eat them. We shouldn't be afraid of the fat. In particular, we should be very liberal even with animal fats. So any of the fats that come from animal products are healthy for us, and fruit fats. And these are the fatty fruits, are avocados, coconuts, olives. Those are oils that we can eat, and we're well adapted to eating them. We should be very careful with refined seed oils, things like soybean oil, canola oil, or corn oil, etc. So-called vegetable oils, and they're not vegetables. You don't get any oils from vegetables. These are seed oils. People just call them vegetable oil because they think it makes it sound healthier. They're not. Don't touch them. They make your fat cells sick and promotes insulin resistance in your fat cells. These seed oils do. Avoid them like the plague. And simply, if someone's not eating their carbohydrates from bags and boxes with barcodes, they'll generally be avoiding those processed seed oils. And we certainly don't want to cook with them at home. And then the fourth is fast. Don't feel the need to eat 5 or 6 times a day. Sometimes don't even feel the need to eat 3 times a day. Maybe eat twice a day. Maybe eat once a day on occasion. And heaven forbid, on occasion, maybe don't eat at all in a given day. Go 24 hours and without eating. And drink, sure, but don't eat or drink any calories. Just keep it simple with water, maybe a little bit of salt if you feel like you need to. But that really helps the body immediately lower insulin, thereby improving insulin sensitivity quite dramatically. And you can finally start really burning. When insulin is down, and can you experience this as you just mentioned, when you're in ketosis, you can tell ketones are simple. They are simply products of fat burning. Every single ketone that our bodies are making were burned from fat. That's all a ketone is. We take this long chain of carbon atoms all linked together. That's a fatty acid or a fat. And then we start splitting it up into little pieces. Normally, when we split it up, it'll go into the cell. Well, it'll be in the cell already, and it'll be used for energy to give the body the energy that it needs to live. When insulin is low, it's almost like the cells of the body, the liver in particular, it's burning so much fat, but because insulin is low, it starts burning more fat than it needs to burn. Even, yes, the fat from our own fat cells, and that excess, that burning more than it needs, if you will, is what's becoming ketones. And then it's interesting to think about what we start doing. We start breathing the ketones out. We start urinating them out. And remember, these are little pieces of almost little pieces of fat that we didn't have to store, and we didn't have to burn based on what our caloric demands were. Did we go on a 10-mile run? No, we're just wasting it now. We're just wasting this energy, which, if you're overweight, is not a bad thing at all because you've got a lot of energy to spare.
Let's talk a little bit about the advantages of the ketones, because since I've gone on this diet, and I read it in the book, but I didn't understand it until I read it in the book. One of the first things that I noticed right away was my tinnitus disappeared. I had
Mm,
bad tinnitus and it disappeared. Uh, my arthritis, it cleared up. I had bad arthritis in my hands, my lower back, my knees, and my ankles, and that cleared up. So there are so many things that happen when you change to this way of eating that affect so many different things of the body. I think part of it is the insulin resistance coming down, because a friend of mine, his triglycerides dropped from 395 to 100, changing to
yeah,
this
that's
way.
amazing.
And it did it in 2 months. I mean, for months, his doctor was just floored at how fast his triglycerides were dropping when he
Yep.
changed to this way of eating. And he
Yep.
was surprised at how much his pain disappeared, his joint
Hmm.
pains, his energy levels rose. So I'm wanting you to talk a little bit about the
Yeah.
ketone advantage.
Yeah. 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 So one note though on the triglycerides is just to help the audience appreciate what the magnitude of what you're saying. Triglycerides are a much better predictor of heart disease, of who's going to have a heart attack. As much as we are a culture that is obsessed on LDL cholesterol, LDL cholesterol levels are alone a terrible predictor of who's going to have a heart attack. Triglycerides are a much better predictor. And so the relevance of this, of your fellow cutting his triglyceride levels down by about a quarter of what they were originally,
Yeah.
that really can't be overstated. His risk of a heart attack has just precipitously dropped. And the reason that's relevant as well is that there's no drugs to effectively lower triglycerides, just like there aren't really drugs that really well lower hemoglobin A1C, the HbA1c. Compare even modest dietary changes, it blows any drug out of the water. No comparison, none. Now, you'd asked about the ketones themselves. I just have to say, much of the systemic benefits that someone experiences in say improving their migraines or lowering their osteoarthritis or improving their tinnitus, much of that is because the body has become more insulin sensitive. So insulin is working better and insulin levels have come down. The combination of those, that's what's improving someone's fertility in men or women. That's what's usually improving the fatty liver disease and so on and so forth. That's not to say the ketones themselves don't have a value. They absolutely do. And so now to answer your question, ketones have numerous benefits that I think are worth briefly mentioning. One, ketones can be used as an energy source for every cell that has mitochondria. Now, the listeners, I'm sure they know what mitochondria are. I'm sure you guys have spoken about the mitochondria. That's the powerhouse of the cell. That's the part of the cell that's taking in nutrients and burning them for energy for the cell to work. Well, every cell in the body that has mitochondria can use ketones for energy. And the only cells that don't are red blood cells. So everything but the red blood cells are happily using ketones, greedily even using ketones. The moment ketones are going up, cells like the brain are immediately using the ketones as an energy source. So that's one thing to note about ketones. They have an energy that's comparable to what glucose has or blood sugar. They have the same kind of caloric value to a cell. Second, ketones are anti-inflammatory. Now, people nowadays throw the word inflammation around far too readily. Everything is inflammation. Everything gets blamed on inflammation, and that's not wholly fair. But inflammation does matter, especially, for example, with something like arthritis, where you will have an inflammation in the joints. Well, ketones inhibit inflammation. They will dampen the cell's activity in that regard. How these inflammatory pathways within the cell are turned on or off. Ketones help turn them off. And then the combination of those, I think, is quite relevant. And then maybe I'll just add one last thing where there's a distinct effect of ketones. And this is something my lab as a scientist, we've really contributed to. And that is how ketones will affect the way the mitochondria work in fat cells specifically. Not only if a body is in ketosis, are they wasting the energy, the ketones, which has a value, a caloric value comparable to glucose, are just being eliminated right from the body. But ketones actually also stimulate the fat cells to waste their own stored energy. Ketones stimulate something called mitochondrial uncoupling. And that's just a clever way, basically, for saying ketones make the mitochondria in fat cells be very wasteful. So now the ketones, the mitochondria within the fat cells just start burning fats and glucose just to create heat, which is biochemically kind of a waste product.
Mhm.
And so the ketones are, in a way, making the fat cell mitochondria be less efficient. Now, that's not a bad thing. That's not a bad thing in this case, because if you have fat cells that are less efficient, that means they just start wasting energy. And so you can have someone who's in ketosis and they might feel a little warmer because their fat cells are literally burning their own fat and glucose just to make a little more heat. Babies do this very readily, which is why newborn babies don't shiver. They don't need to, because their fat is making so much body heat. With adults, we can start to mimic some of this. And we do know when adults are in ketosis, their metabolic rate is higher than normal. Just by changing their insulin and increasing their ketones, metabolic rate goes up, and it can go up by about 300 calories a day. That's not an insignificant amount. That's like climbing 100 floors of stairs. So it's a pretty significant effect. And part of it might be because of what the ketones and the low insulin are doing at the fat cells. Literally turning fat cells from being cells that are only determined to store energy into cells that want to start wasting the energy.
That's a very interesting point. I didn't even think of it that way, because when I tried the traditional exercise more, eat less routine, it took me almost 2 years to lose 56 pounds. And I was hungry and I was sore and I was unfocused. I mean, I had a lot of brain fog when I was doing it that way. And then when we just changed our diet, I lost 99 pounds in the same amount of time without doing heavy exercise regimes and without starving myself to death. But one of the things that we have here, we have a large diabetic community. We have a population of 167,000 people. We have 5 renal centers with another one under construction.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. And so when I did a search, the comparable was the state of Alabama, which has 3 million people. The state of Alabama has 13 renal centers. And here we are on Guam with 5 and another one under construction. A lot of the people who are diabetic here get diagnosed with insulin. And my wife, when 4 years ago, they put her on insulin, and she picked up 25 pounds in a matter of 6 months.
Yep.
So wouldn't, gaining that much weight and adding more insulin to the body do more damage than?
Yes. And Ken, so poor Kim is a perfect case study of the paradigm I outlined earlier. Type 2 diabetes is not a disease of too much glucose. That's just a manifestation of the real problem, which is a disease of too much insulin, and the insulin isn't working right. The body's been drowning in a sea of insulin. But giving a type 2 diabetic insulin, whose insulin levels are already high, is like giving an alcoholic another glass of wine. You're giving the person more of the very substance that's causing the problem. It's the alcohol that's causing the alcoholism. It's the chronically elevated insulin that's causing the insulin resistance. And that is why, not surprisingly, when a type 2 diabetic is given insulin, nothing gets better. No clinical, other than you'd say, well, it lowers the glucose levels. And so you think, well, they should live longer and better. And no, the more aggressively you give a type 2 diabetic insulin to keep their glucose in check, the more likely they are to die. They are 3 times more likely to die from heart disease, twice as likely to die from cancer, and twice as likely to develop Alzheimer's disease. Not to mention, they typically gain 20 to 30 pounds in about 6 months. We are killing them. When we give a type 2 diabetic insulin, we are making them fatter and sicker and sending them to the grave faster, because it's not a disease of controlling the glucose, which is how the typical view wants to look at it. The typical physician only sees the high glucose and says, well, insulin be damned. I'm just going to give you more insulin. Who cares about the insulin? Let's just push the glucose down. And it works. It does push the glucose down. But the proof is in the pudding. This isn't the disease of glucose, because even though you've controlled glucose, you're killing the person, because all you're doing is taking their high insulin and pushing it up even higher.
Yeah, over the space of like a couple of years, she went up to 170 units of
Yeah, that's
insulin.
right. Because she was becoming more and more insulin resistant, because too much insulin causes insulin resistance.
So now let's talk about how changing the diet. We changed our diet to a strict ketogenic diet. We're eating 20 grams of carbs a day or less.
Mm-hmm.
Many
Mm-hmm.
days less. And one of the benefits we noted right away by switching to this way of eating, we naturally started eating less because we weren't hungry all the time. So myself, I dropped from 3 meals and 3 snacks and a dessert a day down to 1 or 2 meals a day. And the same with Kim. And now as she's done that, she's off insulin. She's off her depression medicine. She was clinically depressed and was taking some heavy medicine for almost 30 years, and she's off that. So that was an unexpected but welcome benefit.
Oh yeah, no kidding. No kidding.
Every one of her medicines she's just about off of now, except for her thyroid medicine.
Yeah, well, and that is if she has a true thyroid problem, and that's one that she probably wouldn't come off.
Yeah, but for other people, when you've had diabetes for decades, is it possible to reverse diabetes? We hear all these people talking about reversing diabetes.
Yeah. So conventional medicine will say that it is an irreversible disease, because if you take their advice and follow their typical strategy of drugs, it is irreversible. So you can imagine a type 2 diabetic who's just been diagnosed, they're sitting in their doctor's office, and there would be 2 conversations that could happen. One would be the typical conversation, which is, all right, you've been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. Here is a prescription for metformin, which is a pretty mild anti-diabetic drug. It's pretty effective, but there's no discussion of changing diet. And so the person keeps eating the same way they always have, most especially high in processed carbohydrates, high in refined seed oils that I mentioned earlier. That's the typical diet, whether it's the US or Guam, US proper or Guam or Southeast Asia or the Middle East, all places where I have extensive experience. It's all the same thing nowadays. So they leave the office with a prescription. The only guarantee is that every year when they come back, they will have a higher dose of that medication, and or they will be introduced a new medication. Alternatively, and thus the disease is in fact irreversible if you take that route. If you're trying to treat the disease with a drug that is not a drug-related illness, type 2 diabetes, then it will never fully reverse the disease. So in that case, it is irreversible. But alternatively, the conversation could go something like, you've just been diagnosed with type 2 diabetes. This is a disease of too much insulin, and let's stop spiking your insulin so often. And the best way to do that is to avoid the foods that spike your insulin, which are processed carbohydrates, starches and sugars, bread, cereal, cakes, cookies, etc. And then the magic happens. When you start removing the offending agent, now the disease starts to improve, and it becomes, by any definition, reversed, or dare I say, cured. We've done this, we published a paper over 90 days in 11 women with type 2 diabetes. There was not a single clinical hint of the type 2 diabetes at the end of those 90 days. For all intents and purposes, while they had been diagnosed as type 2 diabetic at day 0, at day 90, they were no longer type 2 diabetic. There was nothing to define that disease anymore.
That's my own experience, because in March of 2020, I was 6.4. And in 3 months later, I was 5.4. 3 months later, I was 5.2. So, my A1C dropped that fast just by making those changes in diets. So what we've got right here, ladies and gentlemen, is the author of the book we have been recommending everybody get as a human body owner's manual, because not only does he eloquently outline the different systems and how they interact at the layman level. It provides you with enough information so that when you're talking with your doctors, you can ask better questions. You know what questions to ask. And in the process, you help your doctors. I've now got a bunch of doctors that are very interested in this changes that I've gone through, because I am proof that they have been able to see and test for themselves. And
Yep.
so when you learn the information in this book, you too can become an advocate for yourself and a better patient and a partner to your doctor, not just merely a patient of your doctor, because your doctor doesn't know how you feel. You have to be able to explain how you feel better. And reading this book will help you talk to your doctor about what is going on in your body and explain it to him in terms that he will understand. I want to thank you very much for your time, Dr. Bikman. This has been wonderful, and I hope we can see you again. But
oh, my pleasure.
Thank you.
Yeah, my pleasure, Ken. In fact, next time, let's do this in Guam. I'd love to come out for a visit.
We're going to try to organize a conference out here, because every year there's a gathering of people on the diabetes organizations, and they're always looking for speakers. And so I'll put your name on the list.
Yeah, please do. Yeah, next year in Guam, as they say. All right, thanks, Ken. This was a pleasure.
All right, thank you. Okay, thanks, Doc.
Yeah, you bet, buddy. Okay, I'm so glad it worked out. Keep in touch. Happy to continue to help the effort out there any way I can. All right, I got to rush off to this. Thanks so much, brother.
Yeah, thanks for your patience.